buying movie tickets,
economics.
going to restaurants.
Big question is the GBA going to do exactly the same
Place
thing?
cash.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to today's webinar on Sourcing Shift, Managing Supply Chains Across the Region. I'm Jonathan Lamport, Chairman of the Chamber's Asia and Africa Committee. Since the advent of the pandemic some 2 years ago, redrawing global supply chain networks has been a key business concern for everyone. Although China manufacturing power is still providing the majority of goods in the world, with a readily available low-cost centralized supplier community and easy access to material and skilled workers. Research by Dr. Neil O'Connell shows that moving manufacturing out of China is a strategy increasingly adopted by corporations, which aims to take advantage of the various benefits and facilities available in other countries. Today, we are delighted to have Dr. Neil O'Connell, Professor, Head of Department Accounting, Monash University, Malaysia, to share his latest research findings and analyze the challenges and opportunities faced by businesses involved in the global supply chain. Without further ado, let's welcome Dr. O'Connell. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Jonathan. And thank you, everyone in the room. This is my first in-person presentation in 2 years. So this is going to be fun. And I just thought my introduction normally is I grew up on a farm. I'm an accountant and I write papers. I'm not a journalist. I write papers, but no one ever reads. So I have lots of fun in the process. And growing up on a farm means that you pay a lot of attention to detail, a lot of attention to what is going on out there. It's always good to read a media article saying that, oh, you know, Apple is moving its capacity from China down to Vietnam. Oh, what do we do now? You know, it's always good to read an article here and an article there, but very few journalists will take the time to actually gather huge amounts of data in an investigative reportive way to understand what are the big patterns that are going on. One thing I'm not going to tell you today is that this is not an anti-China talk. The companies that I've documented, they're moving out of China, there's 132 of them, only 11 of those 132 have decided, oh, we're not going to be in China anymore. Okay, so there's 121 that have just moved capacity out of China. They haven't closed up in China. So the company I was talking about today, the patterns I show you, these are multinationals, these are SMEs or large SMEs that still want to have a footprint in China. And I think that is an important message that I want to get across, because you read one media report, so-and-so is moving from here to here. Oh, that's the end of that country they're moving from. No, globalization is alive and well. What this talk is about and the patterns that we're going to show you is to help us understand better how different sourcing strategies work in different countries, so we can better understand how we can live together in this region and understand that, oh, Vietnam has these complementarities that work well with China, because Hanoi is only 12 hours south from here, and you can truck part of your ecosystem down to Hanoi and go into assembly there. But you cannot do that in Ho Chi Minh City, all right? So there are different complementarities that the different countries in the region bring, and that's the big message I want to give this morning. And so we're going to talk about China's move. And 12 months ago, I did talk about what did the pandemic have its effect on globalization. And the big effect was it really closed the borders. And everyone's throwing their hands up. What do we do now? Last year, 12 months ago, what do we do now with PPE? We cannot get quality PPE when we want to, ship from China to other countries. We cannot get quality PPE. How do we verify that? Now, 12 months later, how do we get quality nitro gloves into other countries out of Thailand? And there's always challenges with quality in global supply chains when borders are closed, because you cannot get people in to verify what is going on the people that you trust to do the verification. On a side note, we'll talk about that later, is that, there was the death of merchandisers 4, 5, 6 years ago. Merchandisers are actually more alive and well today because you cannot go across the border to China to verify your production, but now you can hire a merchandiser to do that for you on the other side of the border. So there's always different, when there are losses, there are gains in other areas in this whole ecosystem, the global system that we are talking about. Wow. So this is 132 companies. Look, here they all are here. And it's easy for me to show this because this is data on public documented in the media reports. We've got over 200 media reports that we have analysed, and it's taken a long time, and I really appreciate my collaborators, Adgar and Su Yun. They've worked with me for the last 6-9 months on gathering this data. It's really interesting here that not all these companies are US firms, right? The impression you get in the media is, US trade war, US are moving out of China. No, it's more broader than that. And so I want you to just step back and see what the patterns in the data are telling us, rather than this be just a one-line story to make a headline in tomorrow's newspaper. And so we've documented from 2017 to 2024 shifts. So in some ways, there are predictive analytics in what we're doing with this data. Companies, especially 90% of these 132 companies, are publicly listed. So they do have to make forward-looking statements. They do have to make statements to their shareholders about their future plans. And so we're documenting planned moves in 2022, 2023 and 24. As you can see, maybe we've gone past the peak of Sourcing Shift. Someone might say, that's because, well, it's too late now to go to Vietnam. Why? Because number one, you can't get a factory for a good price. You can't get labour for a good price. You can't even get warehousing space now before you can ship. That's the case in a lot of countries now. And even if you can get all that, it takes many, many months to get senior people into the country, visas, immigration, all of that sort of thing, for you to actually set up and ramp up production. These sourcing shifts are not a month-to-month strategic decision. These are multi-year strategic decisions that we need to think about. And so take that in mind when we are looking at the patterns that I'm going to show you shortly. Where to move? If we look at most of the movements are in Asia, 18% North Asia and 53% Southeast Asia, some to Europe and some into the USA. Someone asked me once, Neil, what about Turkey? What about Morocco? What about Southern Europe? How come you're not documenting any of that? Well, I'm only documenting what I can see in the reports. The data is not showing that sourcing companies are not moving capacity out of China into Southern Europe in grand scale, okay? Most of the scale is going down to Southeast Asia, okay? Let's keep going on this. All right, so what I did do with the data, and this is not to overload you with the data because I want you to ask some really interesting questions that matter to you at the end of my presentation, but I just want to show you that we want to think in terms of the sourcing shifts that happened when you move into the country for the first time versus, let's move capacity down to Vietnam. We already have contract manufacturing in Vietnam, like Nike has 116 contract manufacturers in Vietnam. Right? So it's very easy for Nike to say, let's just move some of our percentage of order from China to Vietnam. They could do that in 1 week. Okay, but it's different for a smaller company. Maybe GoPro, they moved out of China, they want to move to Vietnam. Well, they've got to set up a new factory in Vietnam. So they're totally different approaches to sourcing shift strategy. And so we want to differentiate that. And you can see that in this graph here, it's showing you all of the red sections mean that they're moving to the country where they have an existing capacity, existing contract manufacturing or existing their own factory. With the blue represents they're going to the country for the first time. Immediately you look at this and think, wow, look, out of all of these, and we know that Taiwan, Thailand, Vietnam, and India dominate, Vietnam is really, really big in terms of companies moving there where they have existing capacity. Whereas India is the other way. There's a lot of sourcing shift going to India for the first time, which is really, really interesting, because we all know that you mention India and you think, logistics headaches, all right? They go together, all right? But maybe in 5 or 10 years' time, those things will be different. And that's something that strategic thinkers need to think about. Where is the infrastructure, the ecosystem associated with my supply chain? Where is it going to be in 5 or 10 years' time? And that's driving a lot of the move to India. And there may be some might say, well, there's geopolitical risk going in there too, because India is sort of separated from China because of the mountains. But you go down to Southeast Asia, you've still got the Spratly Islands and all the geopolitical stuff that's going down the South China Sea. Although, I was reading in the Far Eastern Economic Review nearly 30 years ago about those problems. So, that's always going to be there. So that's how we live with these things in Asia, and we don't make a big deal about that. It's just that countries in other places of the world like to make a big deal about it. Okay, so we have a look at the multiple moves, and there are different moves for different industries, and a lot of electronics industries going to Taiwan and Thailand and north of Vietnam. And I'll get into that in little detail, but I just want to show you that if we look at multi-country relocation, because when you move capacity out of China, it doesn't mean, you have to move to one more country to replace that. No, like Hasbro, they move capacity out of China, then they go to Vietnam, Mexico, and to India, okay? And basically they use contract manufacturing, so they can do that. And the large multinationals, they have the luxury to shift around like that as they do. But Hasbro, did they leave China? No. Okay, so we need to think a little bit more about what is going on. And what we've done with this data is just to let you know, electronics dominate 30% of the sourcing shift. Electronics. Okay, and we can get into detail on that. Going to Taiwan, Thailand, Vietnam is dominating a lot of that move. India partially, but not Mexico. Okay, Mexico is a destination. We need to be in Mexico because we want to get to market within 2-3 days, not 2 to 3 months. All right, and we know like the sourcing shifts that went to Mexico last year and the year before, and the year before that, like it turns out in hindsight, wow, what a great decision, right? It takes so long to get containers on the ships in Asia across to the USA, if you can find a container. All right, so another thing that we can think about in the sourcing shift is that the FDI is driving a lot of development in countries. So some people ask me, what should the Malaysian government do? What should the Vietnamese government do? What should the Hong Kong government do? Well, part of the attraction that governments want to see for their country is FDI. And it's really interesting that Vietnam and Indonesia dominate a lot of the FDI growth in the last 3 years in this region. China is still up there, of course. Hong Kong is still up there, of course. Hong Kong, a lot of FDI in terms of financial investment, things like that. China, more, the property, factories and everything like that, same. But Vietnam and Indonesia growing like wildfires. And same too with Mexico. And you can see that FDI, Vietnam, Mexico, Indonesia, nearly 30 billion in the last year. How does that compare? China, 160, 170 billion. So that's a pretty significant amount for Vietnam, Indonesia that have that FDI going in. Now, a lot of that's going into property, but that's the nature of FDI anyway. Like, do you just want to build a factory and not have any home living ecosystem for the people that work in the factory? You always think, we need a factory, we need workers, but do you ever think about, well, the workers got to live somewhere, they got to shop somewhere, they got to have entertainment, they got to send their kids to school. Like there's the whole living ecosystem that goes with building factories. And that's one thing that the Greater Bay Area has been developing in the last 5 or 10 years, and a lot more work to be done in the Greater Bay Area, and we'll talk about that. Education, health, food quality, these are things that I think are priorities for the Greater Bay Area, right? You get that stronger, and then that will match where the FDI has been going in terms of all the investment, all the design thinking and technology that's going into Shenzhen. It needs to be accompanied by all of these other things that make the whole complete living system, and then it's sustainable. Okay, enough on the home side, but let's go a little bit further. Right, the companies that already established a factory in Vietnam, there was 38 of them, and then those companies that newly established factory in Vietnam, there's 29. And so people think about, let me just have a look. One thing that we don't always consider is that, Vietnam is Vietnam. Vietnam is not Vietnam, because there's a North Vietnam, there's a South Vietnam. And as I hinted earlier, North Vietnam, the ecosystem is 12 hours truck ride from here, just down south, from Shenzhen down to the top, the border, just above Hanoi. And so there's a lot of electronics sourcing shift into North Vietnam. Whereas you look at more sporting equipment, homeware goods factories have set up in Ho Chi Minh City, South Vietnam. So, their connection with the ecosystem, if anything, is by air or by ship. But in North Vietnam, you've got that extra freight over land option. So these are differences that we're documenting. So when we go to North Vietnam, notice there's about 50-50 going there for the first time or already have an established factory. But in South, notice that a lot of the movement to South Vietnam is we already have an established factory. And part of that's driven in the North by a lot of sizable investments in the electronics area. And we can look at some of the other countries. So, for example, Taiwan is dominated. Notice the red means that companies are moving to Taiwan, not for the first time. They already have capacity there. And many of us in the audience know that, Taiwan in some ways, the 30% GDP associated with trade with mainland China, like they're always being connected economically. Okay, so it's not unusual to understand that, in the last decade, 15 years, a lot of Taiwanese companies have been forced to move to the mainland because the companies that they are supplying, like the HTCs, the ACEs and USUS and all of that, they've forced their suppliers go across to China because we've got other Chinese factories in mainland China that can make it for half the price that you're doing in Taiwan. So a lot of Taiwanese manufacturers were forced to China because of costs. Now they're coming back for other reasons. Okay, so it's interesting that, what I'm talking about today is a shift, but historically, sometimes it's kind of like a return to home. And so when you step back and look at the big picture over decades, you can see these patterns repeating themselves. Like India. India is a peninsula protected from China because of the mountains, physical protection. And in many ways, they're kind of got good ties with the USA. So India, in some ways, for those companies that are concerned about geopolitical risk, then India is a safer option than in some other countries in Southeast Asia or Taiwan. Okay, so in Southeast Asia. But notice that a lot of companies gone to India for the first time. And as I said earlier, that partly may reflect a long-term view that in the long term, we will see that the logistics in India will improve. Today, no way can India compete on the logistics. But maybe in 5-10 years' time, things can be different. And so, the large companies are making investments on that basis. If we look at Thailand, Thailand has always been an electronics ecosystem. And notice that 3/4 of the shift going to Thailand have already established capacity there. Okay. Whereas India, there's a lot of move to India for the first time. So that's very positive for India. Now, I'm not going to go through every country, but notice Mexico. Like this is, you're not going to go somewhere that's on the other side of the world unless maybe you already have an established presence there. And that's shown by a dominant sourcing shift going there for not the first time. They've already been in Mexico before. And you can see that there's a lot of US companies in there, but also some electronics companies have decided, for the US market, we actually need to expand our capacity in Mexico. And that's a decision actually made even more apparent because of the problems of getting containers from one side of the planet to the other. And like USA, like the movement back to USA, of course, red dominates. Companies going to the USA for the first time setting up a factory is just over a quarter, but most is it's not for the first time. Indonesia, again, all right, Indonesia dominate. Companies not going to Indonesia for the first time. Again, this is a new country, new in terms of passing the 4,000 GDP per capita only about 3 or 4 years ago. And what we know in the automotive industry is that as soon as the GDP per capita goes above 4,000 US dollars, then that's the time to start selling motor vehicles. And that happened in Guangzhou 20 years ago. It happened in Indonesia about 5 years ago. And so, Indonesia is moving along. And Cambodia, very big on bikes, but it's very interesting. A lot of the equipment that go into the bikes is still imported from China, Taiwan, and Vietnam. And Cambodia was very attractive up until about 12 months ago because they had that trade-free status into the EU, but not any longer. So Cambodia is at a crossroads there about what does it do in terms of sustaining FDI, and that's still challenged. But it's really nice that a lot of the moves are actually dominating the moves that already have an established factory in Cambodia. And Malaysia, like Monash University, I can't present without mentioning my university, and been in Malaysia for 4 years now. And it's just like, a few interesting stories here. How many of you have heard of this little company here, Bissell? Bissell is the oldest company in our database. Like, it's over 125 years old. Like, in the 19th century it was formed. Bissell makes vacuum cleaners, right? And they're private, they're not public. So it's very hard to get information. They've been in China for a long time. They moved to Malaysia just recently, and they set up in Johor. And you're thinking, okay, so what, Neil? So what? Well, interesting, one of their competitors, or probably one of their youngest competitors, and you know who I'm talking about, Dyson, right? Dyson's only been around for the last 15 more years. They never went to China. They set up in Johor, Malaysia, and Flextronics was their contract manufacturer. Wow, what an interesting choice to stay in Malaysia and to have it bear out that, well, I'm glad we're there. Glad we've been there for the last 15 years, and now it turns out, well, very good choice, right? So these strategic decisions, sometimes they come out to be serendipitous. Sometimes they come out to say, well, we weren't sure, we tried, and we failed. But so, if you talk about Hoover and you talk about Electrolux and all these other vacuum cleaner manufacturers, like Dyson's in the top 5 with Bissell, right? And all of those other manufacturers, Electrolux, Hoover, Bissell, and all that, they were manufacturing in China, but Dyson never did. So, these are specific strategic decisions that certain companies make. Of course, Japan, the shift back to Japan is very much driven a lot by geopolitical risk. Japanese government gave huge incentives for factories to move back, and you see there's no blue there. There's no one moving to Japan for the first time. We understand that in the nature of its institutions, its culture. Philippines, okay. So which industries? Very quickly, I gave you insight into the industries that electronics dominates, of course, followed by sport and outdoor and auto. Sports and outdoor, very, very big and growing a lot in a number of countries now, because if you go to Amazon, that's a huge growing area of sales. Everyone's stuck at home. You're buying sports equipment to do things at home, etc. So huge boom. A lot of the containers that are stuck in shipping ports are filled with sports and outdoor equipment. And so enough of some of these. I want to get into the reasons why they move. And this is probably the most interesting part. But before I do that, I just want to remind you of the fact that when we talk about the existing and new moves, we talk about sourcing shift, but really only 32% of the 132 are moving capacity from China to another country for the very first time. Most of these sourcing shifts are to facilities that are already operational in another country. So just bear that in mind. So it doesn't become as a surprise that there's sourcing shift from one country to another when the dominant shifts, 68%, they already have existing facilities in the other country. All right, so reasons, and this is really interesting to think about the reasons because we want to look at the internal industry drivers or external environmental drivers, and we could spend the whole day and go into those 4 different quadrants. But let me simplify it for you, and that is there are issues from China, there are issues from the USA, and there's incentives from the moving country. And for the most part, we understand a lot of the issues from the USA, human rights, xenophobic risks, tariffs, geopolitical risk, which may be a hodgepodge of all of those. And you just don't know the future, so we've got to prepare for the worst. And then you've got incentives from the moving country. So where you get tax incentives, or they already have the ecosystem there, or you can come in and actually get cheaper access to factories, cheaper rental on apartments and things like that. All right, but from China, the issues associated with border closures, fall in China sales and things like that. So how can we differentiate these different reasons? These reasons were content analyzed from over 200 media reports. And most of these reasons that we are documenting is not what a journalist says about why a company is moving. It's actually senior executives of the company saying why they're moving from one country to another. Why are they going to Vietnam? Okay. Some of these, there are multiple reasons. Some are just one reason alone. And so let's have a look at the total. And you notice the issues from the USA dominate, but also there's a lot of incentives from receiving countries. So it's a competitive landscape now. For any multinational that has capacity across many countries, it's kind of like, well, it's like moving from city to city now. You don't have to worry about setting up a factory in another country if you're already existing there. You just change your order quantity from that country to another country. So exactly what Nike did. Like they moved to their contract manufacturers, 116 in Vietnam, and then just ordered more from those contract manufacturers. They didn't have to build a new factory. So what do we learn? If we look at Vietnam, notice there's an even amount of USA, less China, but more incentives from USA. Notice incentives from the receiving country dominate or equal to issues brought about by the USA with the trade war and tariffs and things like that. Okay? So it's the trade war, the tariffs is not dominating this sourcing shift. If anything, you want to look at the data is saying, only 39% are the reasons that we could document. Okay. So what about the other 61%? All right. So media's not talking about that. Wow. All right. So without going too much and blind you with too many of these graphs and slides available for all participants, please, I just want to get to some interesting points that we can show. And that is, we tried to do some algorithms. Neil, this is not an academic talk. This is an industry talk. Stop bringing your academic algorithms into this talk. But the big thing that I like to bring to industry is to help you to understand that we have done some algorithms to find out, well, let me ask you a question, which probably is on the mind of many participants here, is that, well, okay, Neil, you said there's these 17 reasons for moving around, and you showed us Vietnam and Taiwan and India and Thailand, the dominant countries the sourcing shift has gone to. Mexico, USA, a little bit less, and Europe nearly non-existent. Okay, so Neil, so great, patterns. So how does that help us strategically? And you said there's 17 reasons. Well, a big question you could ask is, all right, Neil, out of all of the countries that you move to, what are the factors out of those 17 reasons that may help us predict a likely move to Vietnam, or help us predict a likely move to Thailand, or help us predict a likely move to India? And we all know, strategic thinkers or senior executives, that trade and where you locate strategically is never a single factor decision. It's always multiple factors. You can never, if it was just a single factor, anyone could be a CEO, anyone could be an executive. All right, it's multiple, it's so holistic, these big decisions you have to make. So here's our algorithm. Let's try and predict Vietnam. And what's coming out is, if they're very large, if you're moving a large percentage out of China, if you you're more likely to move to Vietnam, and also the availability of raw materials is more likely to move to Vietnam. And if your global footprint is larger, you're more likely to move to Vietnam. And that may partly be driven a lot by the apparel companies, because only in the last year, Vietnam surpassed Bangladesh as the second largest exporter of apparel, which is just amazing, these trends happening. Can we predict Thailand? What's coming out in Thailand? Well, cheaper land and labour, and the costly land production labour tax in China that is driving out and going to Thailand, because Thailand has cheaper land and labour, relatively speaking, for the skill set that we are talking about. Remember, Thailand already has an established ecosystem, especially in the electronics area. If we look at Taiwan, especially if you're a US company, that really predicts a lot of the moves to Taiwan. It also predicts a lot of moves to Mexico. We understand that, close to market, and also close to home of headquarters too. But if you look at India, what's interesting is fall in China sales and scope to improve the supply chain. Like I said earlier, you're forward thinking 5 or 10 years. We go to India, okay, we're not going to make money in the next 12 months, 2 years, 3 years, but we know we can improve the logistics and there's scope for improvement. All right. And that may not be the case as much in other Southeast Asian countries. So we're trying to predict based on this data, because we've got 17 different reasons for the move. All right, let's move on. Finally, can we predict the extent of move out of China? And so the objective function here, not to be too academic, that is, Neil, you said there was only 11 companies that closed up shop in China, that 11 out of 132. Well, so in terms of the measurement here, those 11 represent 100% sourcing shift, right? But the other 121 represent a scale between 1% and 100%. Okay, so that's the scale. So can we predict, based on the reasons for the move, the extent that you move out of China? And what's coming out? Let's keep logic models. Yep. Okay. Extent of move out of China. We're going to do that. As I said, there's 11 that moved out totally. But here's the models. If you're a US company, that it's more likely you'll move a larger capacity out of China. If you're moving to Vietnam, if the COVID restriction on labour as a reason actually drove a larger capacity move out of China. And cheaper land, labour, no, and tax incentives from the receiving country. So some of those 17 are coming out in terms of which country they go to, and also the percentage of shift out of China. So let's just wrap this up with a few ideas. And, there's a lot of details here. Someone asked me, does the ease of business drive this sourcing shift? No, that's not a dominant factor. And in some ways, you look at the ease of business across a lot of the countries we're moving to, 84 down to 62. There's not much difference between Mexico, Vietnam, and India. They're all at 72, 72, 71. So this is not a big thing. Sometimes journalists or media or associations say, oh, the ease of business, we've got to work on the ease of business. But, increasingly, this may have been the case a decade, 2 decades ago, but increasingly a lot of countries are getting closer and closer together in terms of ease of business. If you look at the holistically in setting up a new country. And as I said, then again, 2/3 of these moves, they're already established in the other country. So therefore, ease of business doesn't matter as much. You're already there, all right? So then that reduces the barriers of moving anyway. So conclusions, where to move? Well, Vietnam dominates the partial moves. North and south, well, it depends on the industry ecosystem. And US-owned companies dominate the 100% shift out of China. But remember, there's only a total of 11 that decided we're not going to China. Oh, one of them was Harley Davidson. They were in the process, 2018-19, I think, of setting up a factory out in North China. And they decided, even before they ramped up production, they said, we're not going any further. We're setting up in Thailand. So we count that, right? So you'd say, you shouldn't count that because they weren't even operational in China anyway. But there was a strategic decision to set up in China. So that's why we do count that. It's very important. Already established factories dominate a lot. And the reasons, right? Incentives from the receiving country dominates. So you think government policies of developing countries, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam, take note. Your incentives are very important for attracting FDI in this area. Okay, US ownership tax incentives drive in Taiwan, US ownership close to market drive in Mexico. So there's things that we're learning from these patterns in the data, and happy to take questions. Lots of lessons learned, it's really interesting. Things about cotton. Xinjiang cotton, like China and India, just a mention on the geopolitical risk. China and India are the largest cotton producers in the world. We're talking about 6 million tons each per year, whereas US does 4 million tons. But the challenge with China is that 5/6 of the cotton produced in China comes from Xinjiang, and so the challenge for sourcing cotton from China is to convince the customs USA that our cotton comes from that 1/6 region and not the other 5/6. That's a grey area because you don't know if you're going to be questioned and stopped at the other port or not. And so for executives, they see that, that's a risk. We need to avoid that at all costs and then make a decision and so forth. But you've got to be very careful about these geopolitical risks. Like H&M found out when they announced last year that, none of our cotton comes from Xinjiang, and then suddenly their brand was blackbanded in China. See, you've got there's a geopolitical knife edge that a lot of these global brand names are walking at the moment, and there's no one way or another way solution to this. And you just got to be very, very careful. The reputation risk on one side, and also the sourcing risk on the other side. So let me just stop there, and happy to take questions and appreciate the opportunity today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. O'Connell. Thank you very much for your presentation. Very informative. So to be the moderator, I have the privilege to ask you the first questions, and then I will have the audience who have the questions, okay? So what role does Hong Kong play in the shifting landscape of global supply chains? What does the increasingly popular China Plus One strategy affect us, and how should we adapt to this?
It's a question we always ask for Hong Kong all the time. Yeah. And that's a question we ask for, what role does any other country play in this? So it's a very important question. I'm in Malaysia, how can Malaysia do better? Right. Okay, Hong Kong needs to recognize the strengths of it being located close to China. And that is really good because it's located to a huge ecosystem. But Hong Kong still has one of the largest container ports in the region. We forget that. We always think, Hong Kong's the financial center. Yes, it is the financial center. So then that is a dominant advantage that we cannot forget. But it also has one of the largest container ports. Does that mean anything? Yes, it may. These are all little degrees. One is that if you're shipping a container from Hong Kong, you may get a different look at that by US customs than if the container is coming from Yanchang across the Shenzhen border. And that was the case 5 more years ago, and still could be the case today. And so there's the opportunity for Hong Kong to increase its voice over the quality of its customs that may be perceived by overseas countries as being higher than the quality of customs in other ports coming out of mainland China. All right, so that's one thing that Hong Kong cannot not talk about. It has to keep on focusing on strength. The quality of its customs is very, very important. So the trust that other customs agents in other countries in receiving the logistics have came from Hong Kong and didn't come from Shenzhen, didn't come from Shanghai, right? Number one. Number two, the other thing too, of course, and Hong Kong's already doing that, building greater links with the Greater Bay Area. But I would say with that is, that government policy, container port, visibility, customs, quality, but on the lower end, SME, or Hong Kong is a hive of activity when it comes to hardware startups and associated with what's going on in the Greater Bay Area, especially Shenzhen. And so that's something that Hong Kong can focus even more on and actually develop even more, especially as a design hub, continuing that in association with Shenzhen. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. O'Connell. Now I would like to have the question from the audience.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. Mark Michelson, IMA Asia. That's a peer group forum of executives who run regional operations for multinational companies. So a lot of them are exactly the ones. And I just want to talk about a couple of issues. One, to follow up on the question that Jonathan asked about Hong Kong. A couple of them, not just ours, but others, have moved their headquarters, regional headquarters, or shifted a lot of it from Hong Kong to elsewhere, in part, at least publicly, because of they've diversified their supply chain, not completely away from China, but more toward the areas you just mentioned, Vietnam, Cambodia, it's Thailand, et cetera. Do you think that's a threat for Hong Kong going forward? And then I have one more question after that.
It's an obvious threat, but and also move head offices secretly move operations to Singapore
I'm talking about
too.
sourcing mostly.
Yes, yes. Yeah, that's an obvious threat, and that's something that Hong Kong needs to be mindful of and play to its strengths. All right, the strength in the talent, the design, and the things that can support sourcing operations, and the availability of talent is something that the government needs to foster. Government needs to continually foster, because the education and talent is really critical, a differentiator as other countries in the region rise up. Vietnam government really realizes that with its talent, and they, through their university system, they just want to develop their talent to a greater degree, as much as the FDI is coming in on the factory and they're making more things and shipping more things, but they also want to develop their knowledge economy as well. So Hong Kong, this is forever a game. You just got to be one step ahead of the other countries in Southeast Asia.
Yeah, and many of them are being aggressive in trying to attract them as well.
Yes.
Singapore as well as others. Just one more question, more short term, but COVID related. As you know, COVID resulted in close down of several factories, especially in Vietnam, elsewhere. And in reaction, several companies moved some of their production back to China, maybe on a temporary basis, and are trying to come back. But I mean, is this important going forward? Of course, we don't know what's going to happen with COVID, but the sense is China might be more expensive, but also maybe looked at as more reliable in some cases. And this was, I'm thinking of garments, electronics, other areas as well.
It's a very good point, because you step back from what's going on with the border closure, and especially Vietnam this year was very, very dire at one stage in June and July, where just complete lockdown. Like this, that will come and go. And so, over the next 5 years, we will get to live with COVID. The border closures is something that we're all challenged with. So yeah, Crocs has moved back to China, or expanded their capacity again in China. And so just a related question that you might ask, okay, so what do we do for strategy? A really, really good example to explain for strategy is a backpack manufacturer, Tacoma in China, they had 4 different lines of backpacks, and they decided that, okay, we're going to move some of our capacity to Vietnam. Did they move those 4 lines to Vietnam? No, they were developing a 5th line, new design, which would require new assembly line, new SKUs, new everything associated with mainly the backpack. They moved that 5th line, the design and everything, down to Vietnam, and then started manufacturing the 5th line separately. So part of the strategy of Sourcing Shift is to think clearly about, okay, are we just moving additional capacity of a single SKU, a single line, or are we developing new lines in another country? And so that's what we need. I think that's what the strategic procurement teams need to think about. So when you move from a country to country, you're not sharing one SKU or one product across 2 countries. And I think that's how they manage that. So if you go so even if you've gone to Vietnam, now you're going back to China, you just hope, well, you already got capacity there, so you can do that. Yes, China will be as big as it is today in the future if there's no going away from not sourcing from China. It's already been said in other roundtables and elements that there's increasingly regionalization or localization where you think, okay, we need to source closer to the market. And I think the border closures, number 1, and number 2, the container backlog is exacerbating that focus that we need to source closer to market. We've probably gone past the peak of the extremes of what's happening with the shipping and the containers. People are overreacting, but you can't do anything about it. You know, I was told yesterday by a local mover, oh, Neil, your container going from Hong Kong to Malaysia just gone from 1,100 US to 2,200 US in the last week. So, oh, okay. So it is what it is. Yes.
Thank you very much. My name's Jonathan Beard. I work at Ernst & Young, mainly around transport and logistics infrastructure. So always fascinated to understand how trade and supply chains may be changing. Again, thank you for the presentation. So nice to see the data presented and also in an accessible fashion. My question is really one of significance, which is sort of what you started the presentation with, because we often see these interesting case studies of someone's used digital printing in the US to do X, Y, and Z. Does this mean we're suddenly going to see wholesale nearshoring or reshoring? So it was nice, as you said, to see, you know, quantitative data presented that gives some indication of scale. I can see these trends are hugely important for Vietnam or Thailand or the countries you ran through. How significant is it for China? Because if you look at China's share of global exports, I think initially there was a view it was peaking in 2016, a slight decline, but if you look at the last 2 years, it's higher than ever. And I think we often forget that the size of China, and as you also said, the quality of it increasingly is difficult to replicate. So while a 1+1 strategy is significant for Vietnam, I suppose my question is, how significant is it for China? Because it still seems to be increasing its share of global exports of merchandise trade.
Very good question. You asked how significant is the future of staying in China, and yeah, that would be largely driven by the growth of the consumer. The question we were asking about China 8 years ago was, when is consumption in China as part of GDP, when is it going to overtake manufacturing? Well, it's overtaken manufacturing, because manufacturing is always, you know, the 60%, 50%, and it's going around there, hovering around there, you know, a decade ago, and then suddenly it's going lower. In the USA, like consumption is 70% of the GDP. China's moving towards that consumption of 70% GDP. When it gets there, by 2029, 2030, the total economy of China will be larger than the US. And so thinking forward a decade, you have to be in China because you're sourcing for the consumption in China, and not just sourcing for consumption in Southeast Asia, and Southeast Asia will continue to grow too. So my answer is really driven by the trend of the consumer, the growth of the consumer in China.
No, I understood, and I think I'd agree. But the interesting point is still in terms of exports, which are not affected, that's not producing for consumption in China. China's share of exports is still increasing, even as we see increasing 1+1 strategies or offshoring or nearshoring. So my question was, to what extent will we eventually see that changing, if at all? Or is it that the fact that the scale of China dwarfs any of these changes we've seen, because China's share of global exports is still increasing?
Okay. Yeah, I don't have an argument against that. I don't. Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you. I would like to encourage participants online to also fill in the Q&A box. So to ask questions, we have one question from the online participant. Is asked by Mr. Andrew Wells. He said, the talk has focused on moving out of the mainland, but much of our members' interest is focused on how to move into the mainland post-COVID, especially now that Hong Kong is to be fully economically integrated with an expanded Qinghai CCE's policy address. How do you think our own Hong Kong corporate, in particular SMEs, will react to the opportunities afforded by the GBA Hong Kong integration in terms of setting up especially high-tech enterprises?
Oh, that's a multi-factored question, and thank you for that question. It's very good. Yeah, I'm thinking about, yes, I have talked about the capacity shift out of China, but yes, but I also at the same time said that most of the companies are not leaving China. All right, so what do you do now? What if you're an SME? What do you do? Well, first of all, get back to the basics of thinking about, okay, the idea of sourcing from many, many suppliers or hundreds of suppliers or dozens of suppliers is something that needs to be consolidated. Larger multinationals have been doing that in the last 5, 6, 7 years, right? Increasingly, especially with the border closures, the communication of suppliers is even 10 times more critical. Keeping that relationship going through digitally is just as critical. Just because you cannot do face-to-face, does that mean, oh, you don't contact them as often? You have to contact the suppliers more often, okay? Digitalization is going to help, but digitalization does not replace the continued development of the relationship. And ultimately, that is what is going to help manage the risk from an SME point of view. What's important is to think about I think that's a big thing I wanted to say in terms of answering that question, that like the communication is so critical. So for the small SME, you may not be as worried about, you know, the high end, you're talking about the environmental and social risks that the big brand names are concerned about, like how they're tackling that is focusing much more on getting more visibility of their supply chain, which they can't. So they're actually employing a lot of merchandisers and other third-party proxies to be in the China, to go into the factory to continue that visibility. SMEs don't always have that luxury, but what you can do, border closure or not, is you've got to keep that frequency of the communication going with suppliers.
Thank you, Dr. Connell. Is there any question from audience? Yes, please.
Hello. Yeah. Thank you, Professor. Because I have a questions, because you always there's a lot of investment into the Vietnam, but in consideration of the size and also the population of Vietnam and also the land price and everything is quite high at the moment. So so do you see that this is still the continued trend of increasing investment in the Vietnam? And the second question is, what will be the next Vietnam?
Oh, is there a continued trend investment in Vietnam? And then what is the next trend?
The next, another country like Vietnam.
Okay, it's interesting. Okay, if SME come to me right now, a large company say, oh, we want to move to Vietnam. I say, well, sorry, that was something you should have been thinking about 3 years ago or 4 years ago. Like even the Taiwanese were moving to Vietnam because of the TPP that suddenly got squashed when the Trump administration came in. But fortunately for those Taiwanese that did set up in Vietnam 5, 6 years ago, they're reaping the benefit because they're already established. Can you go to Vietnam now as a low-cost strategy? It won't work. It's very hard to get factory space. It's very hard to get in labor. It's extremely difficult now to get warehouse space within 50 kilometers of any urban area. And actually, that's the case for any country in Asia at the moment, warehouse space, because there's no ships. So therefore, you've got to put your stuff in warehouses to wait for a container and wait for a ship. So it's too late to go to Vietnam now. And that's something that, you know, unless you have a 10, 15-year strategy of going somewhere and actually expanding even to a greater footprint in that country, and thinking of the consumer in Vietnam for its GDP to rise. So, which will take another decade or more to get to, you know, a substantial level. Like, yeah. So getting back to, okay, so where's the next country? Well, Indonesia is another promising country, which companies are increasingly going to. And that's something that FDI is starting to follow. Having said that, a lot of FDI, you know, there's always a portion of FDI, and I don't know in the data, that is going into property investment and not just into factory investment. And that's something that, okay, they go together because you need good living environment to support employees that work in a factory. Whenever you set up an ecosystem, and I was talking to association in Malaysia, you know, the government needs to focus on ecosystems to attract industry, but also an ecosystem is not just the parts that go into a product that's made, but it is also urban center for employees to enjoy their life while they're working and to have a sustainable life and not just be there for like forced foreign labor. Okay. So, you know, you've got to think of the whole holistically. Where's the next one? Indonesia, possibly. Cambodia, it's not there yet. They had a hand from EU, that's gone away. So it's hard to predict what's going on. India seems like a really good proposition, given a lot of the geopolitical concerns that companies might have in Southeast Asia. Very good question.
Thank you. So is there any more questions from the audience? If not, I would like to ask the question. I think a lot when we speak about supply chain, everybody always worry about the reason, container issues. So what is your view on the current shipping container shortages and delays in sea freight, as well as the skyrocketing shipping and storage costs? Do you think this will be an ongoing or recurring issue in the future as the world adapts to co-living with COVID?
That's a good question. It's on our minds all the time. And I think the peak has passed. Okay, so does that mean, oh, you'll be able to get your container next week and next month? No, I think the worst is over, but it's going to take 1 or 2 years to settle down as capacity changes. Some large companies are vertically integrating to deal with that, like Amazon, like, you know, buying shipping line and then using it to ship their own stuff. But that's not the solution. That's an extreme solution that is not necessary for the long term. The peak is past, meaning that you'll get a bullwhip effect if you think that, oh, it's going to get worse, so therefore we need to build more here and build more there. Here's what we need to do. Number one, we need to, and I'm just going to note it. It's a chance to reinvest. It's a chance to reassess. Who are my suppliers? And do I keep the suppliers? Do I consolidate? It's a chance to re-equip. That is, oh, I've been so busy for the last 5 years just getting orders, shipping, getting orders and shipping, and I really haven't got into the factory to assess its accreditation on ISO, improve their productivity, improve their processes and things like that. So now's an opportunity to visit the supplier through a third-party proxy to find ways in which they can, in this downtime, because you don't want them making stuff if you cannot ship, but you want to promise them an order, but in the meantime, can we work with you to improve how your operations can be more efficient going forward? which a lot of factories I've been to need a lot of help in. They don't know they need the help, but they do need a lot of help. So reinvest, re-equip, and re-visibility. The big thing for the last 5 years, the major brand names they've got is like they need visibility on their second tier, third tier, fourth tier suppliers. They need that. But that's something that we cannot forget now. We need to get it increased visibility. So reinvest, re-equip, and get re-visibility. So employ the third-party proxies as the borders are closed so you get more visibility to suppliers. And finally, just reach out to the suppliers, get to know them again over the line because you haven't had that face-to-face conversation.
Thank you. Thank you for your answer. Seems the capacity, issues and driver shortage remaining for foreseeable future around the world. Do you have any suggestion or solution to companies to resolve the difficulties?
Again, like this is the very extreme things happen. It's like a perfect storm. COVID's happened and then everyone's at home. So everyone goes on Amazon and everyone just buys physical stuff with money that they would have paid for services. And so is that going to be the same year in, year out for the next 5 to 10 years? No, it's going to change. People will start going out more and then stop buying things on Amazon. There's only so much physical stuff you can buy. We're still social creatures where we need to interact. So services and the products component of what's been going on in the last 18 months is going to change. So, services will come back up and the product demand will not be as high as it has been going forward. So I think getting back to, and the challenge in the USA at the moment is that, you haven't got trucks to take containers away from the port. That has already been talked about in the media. And then you haven't got enough drivers to move those lorries. We're at an extreme time. And so at extreme times, it's very hard to say, oh, here's the perfect solution. Sometimes you've got to let that wave go and then strategize on how we can do better going forward. And so there may be opportunities. There's opportunities in corporate of digitization. There may be opportunities in the supply chain to think about how we can better digitize so we can improve the flow of logistics. And that's something going forward, I think that will become a more dominant trend, right? But it doesn't solve digitization does not solve the fact that there's no lorry driver or there's no truck to pick up your container. That's something that's inherent in, I guess, the labor structure of any country that we're talking about, right? So, that's a government policy thing that governments can be more proactive in making sure that, different sectors are looked after in a certain way. So there is enough capacity to keep the flow of physical. Digitalization looks after information. It looks after financing. Digitalization doesn't always look after the physical. And that's why we're so challenged today, because it's the physical movement from A to B. A computer cannot get your container from A to B. You need a truck, you need wheels, you need a driver.
Thank you, Dr. O'Connell. I really believe that, I hope that the wave will soon end, and
Yes.
the physical. But when you're talking about digitalization, how does blockchain fit into the picture? What are the benefits of applying blockchain technology to manage supply chains?
It's a good question about blockchain because we all know about in terms of Bitcoin as an example of how blockchain works. But in the logistics domain, there's a lot of potential in the blockchain to digitize the documentation that's required in the logistics area. The Achilles heel of blockchain, that is the weakness that people need to understand, is the data collection points. So where we collect the data at the moment, we've got endless streams of documentation that drivers have to sign, checkpoints have to sign. So once you can start changing that, where drivers can use a smartphone app that is secure, so you can collect that data digitally, then you can start to expand the opportunity of using the blockchain.
Thank you, Dr. O'Connor. I think today really you giving us a very informative presentation. And on behalf of the Chamber, I would like to present you a gift. And thank you very much for your presentation of today. And of course, thank you very much for the audience participate in person during the COVID-19 and also the audience online. Thank you very much.